Welcome back to Call to Community. We are reading chapter 30, entitled Conflict. Conflict's a part of life. Doreen, do you enjoy conflict?
No, I do not, Rich. Do you?
I also tend to avoid conflict. But do you know anyone who thrills to battle, who enjoys difficult conversations?
I do, and I admire them for that. And I've also learned from people that like to engage in battle, either verbally.
But I guess I think you got to have both. You have to have both kinds of people in life. If everyone thrived on conflict, you'd have constant war. And I think there is a place for people who like to spread oil on troubled waters, be peacemakers. Mm-hmm. We are even instructed to be peacemakers. But sometimes peacemaking requires conflict, paradoxically. And that's what this chapter is about. That's what we have to reckon with when we belong to a Christian community or any community or fellowship. We will have conflict. We will not see eye to eye with one another. And then the question is, how do we come through the woods without making permanent enemies and having irreconcilable differences?
Yeah. And at a higher level, I mean, we're all human, so we're all struggling with the human condition to a different capacity, which means that conflict is never going to be negated, like you talked about. But it's about what your common goal is, and that, in a way, that helps you resolve it, because that goal is always seeking Jesus's way, which is the way to deal with conflict resolution, which does not mean cowering in a corner or running away from it.
So as David Jansen, who opens this chapter, points out, Jesus actually gives pretty clear instructions about how to deal with conflict. And it's a well-known passage, Matthew 18. Doreen, do you want to just recap sort of the 3 steps that we read about in this Bible passage?
Yeah, so Matthew 18 gives a direction. If your brother or your sister sins or goes against what you perceive to be the way of Christ, you can go to them directly, or you should go to them directly and point out their fault just between the two of you. And if they listen to you, then you've won, or we shouldn't put it in terms of winning or losing, but you have resolved the issue. But then if you do not see eye to eye at that juncture, you can go to a pastor or leader within the church and seek help from a third party to resolve the conflict.
It could really be any third party. I mean,
That's true.
Often it will be a pastor or leader, but it really could be, a coworker or just another community member both of you trust. The third step then is, if you can't figure it out in this smaller group, is to bring it to the body of believers, to the larger community of which you are a part. And if at that point the person still refuses to listen, Jesus instructs us that we are to treat that person as we would a pagan or a tax collector. In other words, they are no longer part of the fellowship. They have excluded themselves from the fellowship by being unwilling to find reconciliation. David Jansen, says this is maybe a step that some of us cringe at, but really, if you look at it, if someone refuses to come to peace or to work through a difference, even with the community at large, they've already kind of put themselves outside of it. It's as if they're not really interested anymore in belonging to that fellowship. I don't think, and David Jansen says this, it's not like a 3 strikes, you're out. If you don't listen to me, and then you don't listen to the next person, and you don't listen to the body, then you're out. It's more if you shut down and you're closed to further conversation and become recalcitrant. So those are the 3 steps of how to deal with conflict in a Christian community. And
it sounds easy, but it's not, and it can often, I think there's so many contributing factors, like selfishness is a big one. I think, and we discuss this maybe later on in the chapter, in the next section. We talk about how you can kind of get lost in the weeds because it becomes about winning or losing or being proved right or being validated. And when you kind of approach a conflict in that sense, where you're not putting the common good of the community of the church first, then you can just run yourself into this vicious cycle of retribution and naysaying and trying to be proved right. And it kind of reminds me of the Old Testament in a lot of ways, where I was reading in Numbers, where Moses was trying to bring together the tribes of Israel and lead them to the promised land. And that there was a tribe of Reuben, the tribe of Gad, who found some good sheep grazing land on the other side of the Jordan before they had to cross it. And they knew that crossing the Jordan would mean conflict. So they asked Moses, can we just stay here and claim the land as our own? And that put Moses in a very awkward situation where he knew the Israelites couldn't survive without sticking together. So he managed to negotiate with them and point out that they would not survive as a people if they did not band together in community, and managed to convince them to cross the Jordan. And there, the rest of they say is history, but I just thought that was a cool story.
So that's a great example of people seeing, the greater good of the fellowship above their own personal,
rather than just being
interest.
Proved right or having a chance to see that.
Yeah. And that's a really important, piece of this puzzle. And I think what you mentioned earlier is just essential. How do we come at this process, if you will, or these 3 steps that Jesus talks about? And I think often when there's conflict, there tends to be, at least for me personally, a considerable amount of emotion, either anger or frustration with someone. And those are things that really are not conducive to reconciliation, anger and frustration. But David Jansen, I think, has a he points to something here that if we come with an attitude of listening, especially when someone else is angry, and just manage to listen without, even if it feels like what they're saying is unjustified, listen through the anger, and usually it comes to an end if you can just listen. And people can sort of say what they need to say and get it out. Mm-hmm. And then oftentimes once it's out on the table, the answers are, pretty simple. Whereas if you respond with anger to someone coming or with frustration, or you refuse to try to see their point of view, that's when things tend to get explosive.
So rather than being reactive, to be proactive, to sort through by listening and by responding, then once the other person that's in tension has managed to lay that out there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, listening's a huge component of this. The other component of it, I think, is how we need to welcome, in a way, tension. The second piece of this chapter talks about this. Tensions bring people back to the reality of their helplessness, obliging them to spend more time in prayer and dialogue, working patiently to overcome the crisis and refine lost unity, and making them understand that the community is more than just a human reality, that it also needs the Spirit of God if it is to live and deepen. And often when you go through prolonged periods of peace, or everything just seems to be going well in community, people tend to lose their edge.
Mm-hmm. And
energy, and tend to kind of forget why they're doing what they're doing, and just go to work and do the daily tasks without really knowing what the reason for it is. And tension right away kind of shocks you out of that, and conflict shocks you out of that, and makes you, if you approach it rightly, examine why you're doing what you're doing. And hopefully if it's approached in the right way, it brings us together in a renewed sense of purpose and togetherness.
Yeah, I agree with that. You see it also in nature, how natural catastrophes or like a forest fire can be extremely devastating, but then the renewal that it brings. So I always thought that was also neat in response to community life, is that tension is not necessarily bad. It can perpetuate or bring about a renewal or a refreshing of the spirit. So
there's this famous, at least internally in the Bruderhof, this thing, Emmy Arnold, who was a co-founder of the Bruderhof, she said, in community life, we're either in crisis or we're celebrating. Now, I kind of found that maybe a little too extreme, and maybe you could just also have like chilling as the third. You could have a little chilling in there as well. I think it's also good for the heart to,
Gelassenheit or peace.
Yeah. So, but it's a good insight that community basically does go through these cycles of crisis, conflict, and then reconciliation and moving forward. So, good chapter. Always interested in your thoughts. Thanks for everyone who does comment and contribute. And we'll see you next week.